Good morning, everybody. We are now up to episode 33.
Right.
They all blend together in my mind. In my
Which in exponential growth would be around 10 billion.
Around 10 billion.
So the coronavirus would have gone into space by now to infect other planets.
Yes, it begins. So
Good morning, everybody.
Just to introduce ourselves, and we have a guest today, Xeres Villanueva. Am I saying?
Villanueva.
Villanueva.
Okay. Yeah, and we were mispronouncing your name
constantly. I felt very bad.
So now I feel bad, but it's good to have you on with us. And you've commented a number of times in the broadcast about things having to do with broadly speaking, activist culture, but specifically different ways that oppression kind of peeps its head up in the midst of like our attempts to undo oppression. So I thought it'd be great to have you on and talk about that more in depth. And
we can introduce ourselves.
I'll introduce myself, and then we'll go from there. So for those who haven't watched before, my name is Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm with the director for the Center for. I'm so off this morning. I'm the director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
Yeah, and I'm Daniel Walpert. I direct MICA, Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And so, we're very excited that you're here. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and you can launch us in the topic any way you want to go.
Okay. My name is Xeres Villanueva. I am a co-founder and project director of the We Empowerment Center, which is a grassroots fiscal sponsorship organization that functions as a nonprofit incubator for radical projects and community-related things that we're starting up on. So
that's great. And where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles County, specifically Northridge, California. That's where I live.
Right. Yeah. So we're getting the report from the West Coast today.
That's
So
good.
before we got started, we were talking a little bit about how to even begin with this huge topic of activist culture, and you had a couple of great starting places. So why don't you kind of kick us off?
Where do we begin with this? Because there's one that you see online, and there's one that's like on the ground, and there's levels. There's the actual movements of protests. There's campaigning. If you're into the electoral side of things, so campaign for local like neighborhood councils, or for city and state governorships and leadership. And then there's like grassroots, like community making things, either creating things like intentional communities or mutual aid, or like creating alternatives, or providing people's needs, like to press on issues. So there is a huge swath of movement work going, but it's all about pushing change or alternatives is part of activist culture. And online is still part of activist culture because there's a lot of great work done online. So it's all a huge part of that.
Yeah. So, I think even just sort of noticing that and pointing that out is really helpful and important to people and empowering, because I think a lot of times we can get very myopic and say, oh, activism is just this one thing.
Yeah.
Right. But, you just mentioned 10 different things, all of which have their own worlds and dynamics and engagement, different ways of engagement. And all of that is trying to potentially work for good in the society. So I think that's very helpful just to name that.
It's a huge spectrum, and as someone who co-founded with longtime activists, unionists, and movement workers, and for the organization, learning history from that lens, there's like so much. But the one thing that we try to do But the reason why we co-founded the way we co-founded is more to deal with the replications of power structure that we end up seeing in activist communities and non-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, the non-profit industrial that we participate in.
Mm. Right. So when we were talking earlier, a couple of the things that you mentioned that are issues that you're trying not to replicate have to do with leadership issues and also have to do with issues around emotional work in groups.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could say a few things about that, what you were thinking about that and talking about.
It's observing people working at Occupy movement, which is obviously the reaction to the financial crisis, obviously, and many, many things before it. This is like 2011, 10, 11, 12, within that stream, and observing and people participating in it and support some movement workers in that. And while they're trying to, the politics is I've aligned with and the structure, yes, but a lot of them unintentionally underestimate like the biggest thing I noticed is that in the name of trying to be a leaderless movement, they're eschewing accountability. So the biggest thing from seeing couples experiences and the fallouts and not be able to sustain themselves or to evolve from where they are. Mm-hmm. Give me and through movement work for many years and in many discussion faith-based groups who try to put justice issues into the center, healing groups who want to put justice and healing together in many things for many years, and it's mostly three to four things. The biggest one is like a lot of like still in this good disregard of emotional labor and mental load and competency in those areas and make that important in leadership decisions. Mm-hmm. That's usually I notice that one of the things that's replicated is that they don't take emotional labor and mental load capacity seriously in any movement. Right.
So for those who might not be familiar with those terms, maybe you could give some definitions for that.
Well, there's a lot of definite you can go, but emotional labor means knowing how to care and knowing how to hold emotional capacity and resilience. Mm-hmm. It is also like we call in a lot of in disability activist groups care work. And when I mean emotional load, it means like remembering keeping track of how things need to be maintained, how things need to evolve, keeping track of who needs to be taken care of, keeping track of what decisions are important and for whom and for what, making discernment decisions, a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And try to maintain like that maintenance, but also keep it clear about how to hold space for things, which they don't realize how invisible that is. Right. Like because they think it's just like housework related issues, but it's also how do you make people work together mm-hmm. in a way that suits them and helps them evolve into the roles in organizing.
Right.
You know, it seems like this is the sort of stuff that often gets minimized because it doesn't seem to fit into kind of effectiveness kind of thinking. Like if you're just trying to accomplish some sort of goal and we're going to get there as hard and fast as possible, then like knowing how to, respect the different kinds of labor people bring, emotional labor and taking care of each other just seems to get pushed aside.
Yeah, and a lot of strategy work gets pushed aside because part of it is just to manifest an outcome, which takes honoring the process and strategy. Mm-hmm. And that usually gets pushed aside a lot, mostly because of the urgency and wanting it like this thing. If we don't get that or this productivity, internalized capitalist productivity, that if we don't accomplish these goals, then we're going to lose therefore the ruling class is going to kill us, therefore it's hopeless, blah blah blah. that kind of thinking that goes to the lines, and then you get this weird thing of throwing our bodies against the machine, thinking that's an acceptable strategy answer for every situation.
Yes, and then it's also intensified because usually if you're raising donations or seeking grants, it's very results oriented there too, and so there's always this pressure, I think, in a lot of nonprofits just to kind of throw bodies against the problem as a way of showing, like, look, we're a good investment. Right. Look at how many bodies we throw against this problem.
Yeah, that's basically what they end up doing, rather they intend to in that.
Right.
But it ends up not being efficient and effective.
Right. Yeah. So, for example, and again, one of the things that's great to me about this video cast is that we're often talking to folks, people are watching this who aren't necessarily familiar with a lot of these topics and a lot of this language. And so, like one really good example, I think, of what you're talking about that I heard recently, and this was from somebody who was actually one of our guests who does a lot of disabilities activist work, was saying that she's on this national panel, this national organizing committee for disabilities work within a church body, and they were going to have a kind of a little retreat or training thing about this, and they were going to have it at a house that was not accessible. And the woman that was organizing this actually called up our friend and said, "Oh, is this okay that we have this at a house that's not accessible?" Right? And this is a perfect example of this lack of awareness of emotional labor and work, and how, so again, the person that's empowered in the dominant culture just sort of then puts all that emotional work and labor onto the person who's oppressed by the system, forcing them to say, no, this is not okay. No, you need to pay attention to these issues, right? They've got to do the emotional work of bringing up all that stuff, which is very problematic.
And that's the biggest one. Another big one is I wrote it in an article I wrote about values that we internalized in our movement, but the biggest one is this slip in on treating ourselves what I call managed care approach, which relates to leadership, this dynamic, like I'm like the provider, you are the one receiving help, not seeing the receiver help as also a giver. And the lack of, which leads to basically, like when you see in certain dynamics of social work and helping professions, like just condescendingly white, like treating a patient as like less than sort of dynamic, like you're like the customer's relational service dynamic that they unintentionally replicate.
Right. Yeah.
Like in how they try to like get people to get recruited, or how they try to get people to lead and follow or build leadership, which treated it as customer service, like I'm provider and this person's a recipient. No, beyond that dynamic, with no higher standard of accountability or goodwill or making sure or discernment if that relationship is right for them in the group.
Right. Maybe Kathleen, I think, has a good comment, kind of a comment/question we could respond to here.
Kathleen writes, I think I am hearing that physical productivity can become an idol. Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's the sort of thing we internalize a lot. In our society, we think we're a meritocracy. And so if you're productive, then you earn your keep. And if you're not productive and kind of the ways that we think we're supposed to be, then we must suck. And so there's always this pressure to like live up to some sort of productivity, which is problematic for all kinds of reasons. There's some classism in there. There's a lot of ableism tied into that. And then when we bring that into activist culture, it actually undermines like what we're saying we're wanting to do in the world.
Mm-hmm. Ironically, doesn't make it effective results-wise even, but we keep doing it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in the in the psychology world, one of the ways that we talk about this is the kind of process versus content dilemma, right? That there's the content of what we're talking about. So I may be talking about, overthrowing oppression, but then there's the process of how I'm doing that, and if I'm doing that in an oppressive manner, then I could be saying the right things, like the content could sound good, but the process is not changed, right? And certainly, again, in the psych world, one of the hardest things to do is to get people to pay attention to process. We're so easily distracted by content. And whether that's, results content, whether that's just intellectual content, whatever kind of content that may be, that is just very distracting. And as you said, taking the time to hold space, to promote some of these other processes is, something we're not very good at.
Yeah.
Well, and then this other piece you were talking about most recently, this sort of, I can't remember the term you used, but this kind of a service model where you have clients or recipients. And, lots of folks have talked about how this reinforces the system because someone's perpetually in a place of having to receive without really having any say in the process as a whole. I mean, it reminds me earlier on when we were doing intentional community, the Mennonite worker, I tried to fundraise, and a lot of these grants wanted to know how many bowls. It's like bowls and beds, right? How many people are you feeding, and how many beds are you giving?
Why is that in their business? In all honesty, that's the kind of thing. Like it's obviously not about accountability. It's about like means testing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Out of people, which leads to another one is unintentionally means testing character and actions without larger context.
Mm-hmm.
Usually is that they don't realize like one way of means testing, which ties into it, is mostly spilling the beans on how traumatized you are. Two ways: how traumatized you are enough that you are more oppressed, or how least traumatized, how much you overcome that you are a better leader. Either of those things, and how we do internalize means testing out of it, like for example, especially in services, you have to write out your trauma, either your trauma history or or all of your achievements. Either of them are none of their business because you just want to ask their services, and to just prove that you are worthy of the services. And that gets replicated in activist culture to prove how better of an activist you are, just because or how prove that because you can march, because even if you could do radical things that don't involve like going to a rally, or if you want to do a rally, like it has to be done a certain way.
Right.
So that happens a lot, or because that's a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of the things that you've found that are helpful to counter these problems? What are either some techniques, awareness, group process? What are some of the things that, like when you guys are helping a group or a movement, and what are some of the ways that you're working to overcome this?
I mean, I'm going to speak for myself, like in my own journey of healing and intentionally finding groups, which I'm fortunate to work with groups and art groups that are good to work with. And the biggest one is, I know this is not something that doesn't get talked about. Don't look at also what they value and what they're doing and not just what they say. Look at what they actually value and what they say, and not just think that they have the same political opinion. Is the big one. Learning, and also learning to hold that accountable to yourself in a group, which is probably harder than it looks, because we want to think that they want to, the urgency and wanting to find people who belong to. But it's crucial to get to know the values of the group and the activist group, and look at what they're saying or what they're doing, how they're relating and doing, not just what they're saying.
Right. Yeah.
That's the biggest one, which a lot of people don't probably out of denial, or probably out of just, fear, or wanting not to lose opportunity, and they don't want to look at just seeing how they do or say. And feel like if they look at that, then they're seeing them as a bad person, and it's not the case. It's just that they're just not at the same level. It's just not a match. And they're not where you are. They're not where you are. There's no need to judge yourself, but people afraid that they're judging them or what. If we actually look at what they're doing and what they value first.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things I'm hearing is that to do this kind of work that you're talking about with integrity takes a lot of courage and takes a lot of personal empowerment. I mean, you're talking about things like taking time to look at things. You're talking about internal personal accountability. You're talking about really kind of sticking to what you feel is important and not getting lost in what somebody else is doing. I mean, those are all not easy things.
No, that's the hardest one.
Because
you want to be part of a big movement, but that's the biggest step. And another big step is learning to think of what you want and what you desired and what the group desires, like a straight face, basically. Rather than not without any judgment, but just what they truly in their straight face, not what they're thinking. That's the most important one, and that's another important one. Which through that process, I learned to develop relationships where it's easier to manage and still in community and with more integrity because of that. But it's really looking at your own desire and the desires of the group and be present in it accordingly, which is also hard because you're taught not to.
Right. Yeah. No, that's what that brings me to mind is the process of spiritual direction is basically one of kind of uncovering your deepest desires, right? And it is amazing how, for so many of us, and you're right, we're just not trained into this. That basic question of like, well, what do I really want, is not an easy one to answer.
That's what you need, because it's easy, and it's more difficult when you see groups that are decent groups, but they're going in a different direction than you are and your groups, and when you're not trained in desire, then it's like there's going to be a conflict, and you don't know how to do a conflict, and you don't know how to deal with when internalized oppression comes up, and you don't realize that those two groups that you're trying to work with are completely different purposes. with their own baggage that they together it's more toxic than separate. You know, and a lot of us don't want to face that either.
Right. Well, we're getting down to the end of our time already, and so again, folks that are out there, if you've got questions or comments or reflections, we've covered a lot of really rich things, and you know, and it really, I mean, all of this that you're talking about really reminds me of spiritual life and practice, and a lot of what we've been talking about. Off and on in terms of during this pandemic time, right? Really trying to think about, you know, what do we really want and need? What is important in society and in our actions and activities, and so it's great that you're highlighting all of that in terms of activism. Is really, really important.
What do you think, Mark?
What's that?
What do you think?
Oh, I'm just sitting here listening and thinking about, I mean, the things you're talking about where it fits within activist culture, but then it, you know, church culture, like basically anytime a group of people come together with some sort of goal to do something other than what's actually existing in front of them, there's going to be these sorts of things that come up. And in my experience in activist culture, because so many of us are coming from a place where maybe we've experienced trauma, and are struggling. It's one of the things that pathologies I notice a lot is it's easy for someone who's fairly abusive to come into those situations and dominate things. And so I've been thinking about that, like, especially a time right now with this pandemic. We have a horrible president now, and in some ways he embodies that too. Like people, a traumatized group of people who want something to change, allow some abusive person to come in who offers quick and easy change, and then everything gets worse. That happens in activist cultures and movements all the time. And it's telling people that, no, we should slow down and try to do relationships well and nurture each other well and mutual aid well. It's often met with resistance.
And they try to do our strategy well, like to be really strategic and implement them first before you try stuff. Then they think we don't have time for that.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it's that urgency, like, I mean, within the Catholic worker world, which is one of the worlds that I inhabit, you see that a lot. It's the faithfulness versus effectiveness conversation, and you can fall off either side of that too easily. Like, we want to be effective. We want to affect change. We want things to get better, but we can't just assume there's a way to overdo that, right? Just to be so goals oriented that you cut down people always feel stifled in communities that are overemphasizing effectiveness. But if you focus too much on faithfulness, doing community well, you can just become a little insular group that doesn't do anything in the world.
It's like this balance of, I mean, we still don't have, I think the trouble is that basically we don't know what it's like to handle our shadow and all of ourselves, including our shadows, well, in a way where we can accept feedback well. We can know when discernment really is discerning, know when to take action and when to sit down. Like knowing that we can make those kind of decisions well together. That's a challenge for a lot of us. And considering the abusive culture being a big part of the empire, we're used to it. It's hard to detect, like, not to have it in our space, or how to have accountability and stop it.
Here's a great comment from Catherine. I appreciate this conversation so much. Thank you, Xeres. I really appreciate you talking about with difference in activist mindset in a way that is non-judgmental. I've been a part of groups trying to challenge ableism and toxic masculinity within movements where it felt like that internal argument became its own form of harm. Like it didn't matter if you were right. The conversation itself was hurting people because, like you said, the people in it were not a match. eventually, and then it trails off there. There's a lot. There's a lot in that comment.
Well, I think that's actually a great place to end, especially with the appreciation part. And I'm so glad you joined us. And of course, you had to get up extra early because you're on the West Coast. So
thank you.
And it occurred to me that this is probably one of the few times when that joke, which I first heard in LA about going to play on the freeway. You actually probably can play on the freeway in LA right now.
We had there have been times where on a few newscasters or news like hovering the helicopter, and saw because the traffic reformer is so bad. Like one time, like a taco truck just opened and everybody's like all passing on because they're all like sitting and waiting and waiting. That's real. That's not stranger. That's not fiction.
Wow, that's great. The taco truck, the freeway,
and then passing to drivers. They're like, "Oh, you're waiting." So it's like, there was a new Jack thing. That's a big reason why they can afford that. But that's how it happened. And it's like, that's funny.
That is funny. That's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening. And Tuna, we'll be back tomorrow talking about something.
We don't know what.
We don't know what.
We'll figure it out.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.